very glad to be here. The first time I went to a Council on Tall Building meeting was in Hong Kong in 1990, and it's great to finally be back here, actually China the first time. I'm also here as a trustee of the Council on Tall Buildings, and I urge all of you who are not members of the Council to please join. This is in fact the only organization I know that includes architects, engineers, contractors, developers, especially consultants, all in one organization, and I think it's great to have it here. As you know, SOM is a collaborative practice of architects and engineers, and as Brian and I were going over this talk, we decided it was going to take too long if we both did it, so I'm going to turn over to Brian here in a second. I would like to say that during the development phase, during the development phase, I was just spoke about, Mark Sarkeesian and Adrian Smith were working on the building we're in now. Brian was up in Beijing working on the ICBC. So what we're going to talk about is the progress since this development phase to today. And so what you're going to see here is the work of 22 years of work here in China, and how we progressed over that time frame. And so at that point, I'm going to turn over to Brian. But if you have structural questions, I'm here, Mark Sarkeesian's here, and Chuck Bejak's probably in the room somewhere. And so we can handle any questions you have in that range. I'll turn over to Brian.
Thank you. Appreciate Bill ceding his time to me. He knows I'm long-winded, so I am going to try to launch into this. We thought about the issue of how do you create architecture that is unique, is different, it creates a sense of place. And it's a tough question because it involves many things. How do we create an architecture that's lasting value for communities that are progressive while allowing for the tremendous growth that's happening in Asia right now? I think you understand the code of numbers on the bottom. How do we advance the science of building effectively and create places that address the human condition? And then how do you have tall buildings that can be unique to the specifics to the context? And the projects I'm going to show are a little bit personal. They are projects I've been involved with, but I'd be remiss to acknowledge the hundreds of people at SOM that are architects and engineers and designers that have been a part of this collaborative process. As well as the many consultants I see out in the room. In fact, we could do a lot of damage if we all got together and tried to think about the tall building. And as well as the very good clients and enlightened city officials. So we believe that in thinking about buildings and thinking about places, the context of the tower is obviously very important. And sometimes it's a site. For a project that we did in Hong Kong. It was a very small site, something that was a part of that density, that wonderful density of the city. But how do you find a way to develop light, view, and air in a very small site that's an intersection of many pedestrian paths, and many of you might know of this location by looking at the site plan. And how do you develop something that might be a different paradigm for structure that raises program up on a great tree trunk, concrete core, with cantilever floors for office spaces that are part of light and air and trying to maximize the views. But there was actually another benefit, and that is at the site, it then opened up at this intersection of many pedestrian paths, the existing historical facades, and it allowed there to be an environment of retail, of scale, of people moving through the block of the city. And so this was just one idea of how maybe that specific place in this very dense center of Hong Kong allowed us to think about a tower in a different way that might yield some innovative ideas. Sometimes it's a city. For a project in Beijing, a headquarters project, it was across the street from the existing headquarters, so it was a direct symbiotic relationship between those two buildings. But more importantly, this company wanted to think about how they could communicate their mission, their goals to the public, and it dealt with being open, transparent, about highlighting certain aspects of that company, which in this case was a museum and art companies and communication companies. And so we gathered those elements in a special element that's framed by this great window that looks out to the city. In doing these things, we often rely on a teamwork of very talented engineers and architects to think about how to intensify the experience of these elements. Because we do think that it is in the making of architecture that is where you derive that special quality that makes places memorable. And our engineers devised these very special elements that then we exposed, that then allowed us to think about the rest of the building as being part of a stronger identity for this company, which was about its power and its gravitas, its stability, and then related this building to the city, which is Beijing. We think of Beijing as a city of walls and solids, and dealt with a quality that made the building into something that was very much not only open and transparent on one hand, but also environmentally responsible on the other. And then thinking about materiality so that it had a quality that linked it to the place and to the things that are inside. Sometimes it's the context of the landscape. And for a project we're working on right now, it is at the junction, the banks of a river, bordered by mountains and a landscape that is quite beautiful. And we developed this fluid series of forms that dealt with not only the towers, but also the podium, landscape, and surrounding buildings to make this context. One of the interesting things about this tower was that it's actually two very slender, 2,000 square meter towers that then rely on each other in terms of developing not only structural strength. As you see, these are braced together by Bill's very expert group, but also rely on each other in terms of the vertical movement, so that we actually developed movement systems for programs that would be in one tower in the other, because it worked that we actually had space and we were actually better able to use those lease spans. It also then shared common elements of building systems to make the building environmentally responsible and work, and actually find a way in this coal city to be a symbol not only of the company that is sponsoring it, but also this very charming document that I got from one of the chief architects from Beatter that talked about the site and how the building had some poetics that linked its programs and its development to this landscape. We also think that in addition to context, program, an expression of program, and invention of new ways to think about the program that ultimately lead to an experience is of a high order of exploration. We try not to be willful in terms of how we manipulate buildings. We definitely do not like to try to find some analogy, populist analogy, and say it looks like this or it looks like that. But we try to think about real solutions, which in this case were 4 buildings that were on a very tight site. And we developed this hybrid tower of very slender forms for 3 residential towers that had light and air to these very slender legs. But then they were capped off by a hotel that linked the tops of buildings together, and then also alluded to other bridges that also supported those legs and provided a way that you could develop this network of movement and circulation within the 3 towers capped by the 4th tower form. It opened up many possibilities for the site to generate the appropriate setting for the building, which is next to the City Hall, and then allowed us to think about each of those programs in their most primary and experiential form, so that it's the best housing that we could devise. It's the best hotel and most efficient hotel that we can devise. And then it's wrapped in this system of cladding that provides a series of rooms for either the hotel or the residential that are responsive to the sun and to the climate of the city. Now, admittedly, many of the buildings that we do are towers, and I'm not going to talk about the condition of towers meeting the ground. I'm sure there's going to be other people talking about that, and especially the urban condition. But we do think that sometimes that urban condition can be a part of that experience in the tower itself. And so what we called this project, which was a competition for a mixed-use project, and on the banks of the Huangpu River, a vertical city that tried to think about the elements of its context, particularly the Yew Garden context and the historic city, and wrapping it into the tower itself and into the forms of the building. So that instead of just isolated singular objects, it became a building that was complex in terms of programs that interrelated to each other. It was complex in terms of the ability to get landscape on the buildings and up high, where actually you could enjoy it and participate in that experience. And then tied together with circulation that made, again, a three-dimensional network, a three-dimensional series of paths that then allowed you to think about how that building could define itself and create a series of spaces that intensified that quality of the tall building. And so we obviously think of ways that that space and those elements and spaces are made can then develop a sense of scale to the river, and yet also a sense of scale to the surrounding context. And that while you're able to get outdoors and appreciate the sense of the city, there's also ways to develop new perspectives of your experience in the tall building. And so this project was really an experiment in terms of trying to take that vertical village up. Now, we are architects and engineers that very much believe in a rational and optimized structure, and that it does boil down to how do you create efficient places of work, live, recreation. For this project on the banks of the Pearl River, it very much was oriented to view on the north, and then developed a offset core, which is a very understood typology, but we took it to the next generation in terms of letting the structure be very robust so that it was a structural spine that provided shading on the south, developed an opening through the building that relieved wind pressures, and yet also was a place of refuge, both during emergencies as well as during the typical workday. Had a space that was a very beautiful space with light on two sides of the room. And then had a structure, that, as I said, that was very stiff and strong, but allowed then the core elements, which are normally in the inside of the building, to be turned inside out. And that those core elements then are part of a new way of moving up and down, so that those elevators and lobbies might be full of light and view. Even the bathrooms have light and view. And that as the buildings come down to the ground, we do think that quality of considering that place, that environment of, in this case, Guangzhou, where it's very lush and tropical, developing a sense of gardens that then relate to the paths to and from the buildings and to the other ancillary spaces, and to the quality of how you move into the building so that there's a transition from the intense light and heat to secondary spaces that are maybe a little less hot, then finally, and less light, and then finally into the use spaces within the building, so that there is an experience from the curb to your office space itself. We think that also buildings, particularly in terms of tall buildings, need to rely on a structural idea and yield a building form that is recognizable and has a certain, in this case, elegance as a marker to the center of the city. We developed this plan that was part of a larger master plan and complex. It has a series of sky lobbies and double-deck elevators for a greater amount of efficiency. But what I find really interesting about this building is that in this classic order of the column, with a column-like form, that develops this emphasis of the gently bulging out shape that then tapers to the top. We devised an idea of the wall that was a pleated or faceted wall that had common window units that extend up, but that you see that the pleats change in terms of their angles. So it allowed us to negotiate this very beautiful but complex form in a very subtle and simple way And the outgrowth of that meant that we had an efficient floor. We had a great core that was a steel plate core developed by our engineers in one of the first steel plate cores in China. Had a moment frame, but there are 32 then corner offices, because each one of those cantilever bays was in, again, that was a very special place that was made not just by the building, but by the engineering and by the configuration of that exterior enclosure. And so this building is a marker for the center of Tianjin, and it plays on the kind of climate and the light in a very special way. And we think that that quality of developing something that is partly abstract, but partly allowing for the citizens of the city to then adopt it and say, this is our marker and our center. The building is also very efficient in terms of its relationship to wind because of that gently tapering shape and the softness on the edges, as well as the serrations. And taking those same ideas, we worked with Bill's group and developed a very interesting building that we're currently working on that has similar ideas about mixed use and the qualities of a building that have that characteristic of a 24/7 activity throughout the tower, but also recognize that each one of those spaces have very different requirements in terms of their lease spans and the floor heights and the kind of qualities of access. And so the office at the bottom is bigger because those lease spans need to be more efficient and have certain kinds of qualities. The hotel in the middle was actually smaller in terms of the lease spans, and then the residential at the top was larger and it needed a little bit more. And that yielded this bottle shape, very fluid form, that also thought about how those concave surfaces and convex surfaces worked with the plan. And then we devised a structural system that was an innovative idea of, in addition to a moment frame that had 9-meter spacing for columns at the base and this 520-meter tall tower, which is actually, we think, quite beneficial to those office spaces. There's a diagonal mega column that links each of the 4 sides together in a way that traces those convex and concave surfaces. And when we went into the wind tunnel, which was very early, and Phil Baker tells me that one of the biggest things you can do is generate an efficient form for the structure. This quality of designing by recognizing wind was something that we were able to develop a building that was efficient in terms of each one of those uses, has a very strong iconic quality, and then has a great efficiency in terms of reducing the accelerations and then reducing the wind base moments, and ultimately saved our clients tens of millions of dollars. And that idea of developing something that works on all levels, that's not just a willful idea about making a form because of textures, patterns, numbers, whatever, but really looked at performance and sustainability, and particularly climate, in a place like China where energy is going to be one of the key issues in terms of its development. We think that buildings don't always have to look the same. In fact, one of the things that we did with this project in Guangzhou was to think about how every building today you see in China is a blue-green glass and silver mullions and has a sameness to each one. So how do you develop something that dealt with shading, has an efficient floor plate, has lots of corner offices, has terraces on the corner, allows for the kinds of cultural business models that people can market today, but develops a very simple idea about the spandrel and how that spandrel can change as it moves around the building, whether it be at the broad faces or at the corners, and yields a quality that is very voluptuous and very different and about more of a shade and shadow in a hot climate. We then took that language and then repeated it in the base of the building and on the other secondary buildings in order to develop some identity that you feel that this is something specific to this place, to this program, and to this building owner. Another building that is under completion right now is a tower that also is very simple in terms of its square floor plan. And we recognize the issues of the market about light and air and flexibility. And we devised a structural system that was based on a moment frame, but then it also had a very clever diagonalized system of braces that reduced the inner story drift. And that idea allowed us to save material and have accelerated construction. We also know that tall towers have positive and negative pressure on them, and that understanding how that pressure works on the facades, to then devise a system that, with that strapping structure that moves around the tower, developing a double wall that reduces the heat loads on the inner wall, reduces the ambient temperature, allows for heating and cooling benefits, gave the quality of this building something specific to this hot stove city of Nanjing. And the building's going through finishing up construction, and we hope that we'll be able to test those results and test those assumptions. For a project in Beijing, and you might be familiar with this one, is a very simple structure, and we talked about its primary form and being as quiet as possible, and not to be an exuberant form, but to really signify and represent the dignity and the elegance of this China World Trade Center as being the center of the CBD. And here it was really taking a square plan and a core that was actually developed with our local architects, and then developing a well-crafted wall that dealt with the light in Beijing, the quality of the air, the ability for that wall to reflect light into the spaces, for indirect light into shade, and to have something that then tied into the base in a way that was dignified and something that marked the center of the CBD. We're currently working on the master plan to tie the buildings together, and then a second phase that also looks at many of those same themes of efficiency, construction costs, speed, but also thinks about how we could maybe accelerate some of the ideas about the exterior wall so that it did perform even better than that previous one. And here we discovered if we tilted the facade out about 5 degrees, it yielded significant reduction in the heat loads on that glass, both during the summer and the winter, and also reduced the glare on those spaces, and provided a surface that would be self-cleaning because most of it wouldn't be subjected to the qualities of the Beijing dust. This project is currently going through its approvals, and we think that there's actually an interesting tie-in to the existing tower in terms of its singular form, but also represents a little bit about growth and kind of a certain organic, natural quality. And then I'm going to finish up here with a project that we're currently doing that I think represents many of the same themes that we're talking about and we believe are important to our practice, which is about understanding certainly the zoning elements, and in this case it's a hotel and office building project. But we had an idea where height really isn't an issue, and we're actually able to carve elements out of it in this tight site. And so we're then able to develop a building that was a building that brought the context of the light, the heat, shading the heat, and the landscape into the building, developed an atrium in the center to organize the hotel so that light might come down into those common spaces, developed then terraces for a majority of the rooms that would be a way that the experience, again, this idea of creating a memorable place that might be, in this case, a hotel guest room, where you had water, you had dappled light, you had a quality that you can open the windows in shade and get breeze, and then develop a structure that was taking off some of our earlier explorations and research on the cantilevered floor with a strong core that then yielded a place, an experience for this hotel that had an incredible amount of privacy, even though they were connected terraces, a structure that was integrated with the cantilever that then developed a quality of screening for those facades, and those screenings are part of the diagonal bracing, that then provided shade and wind circulation into a space that then created a unique quality that is based on rational architecture, engineering, trying to develop innovative uses of materials and structure, and then trying to bring that experience into the building so that you would remember it and that you would create the sense of place. So I'm going to thank you very much.